going to hone in a little bit more specifically on an idea that Quigley points out, which is weapons technology and military technology in societies and civilizations, and that the political structure of Earth, basically, but more specifically, the political structure of societies and civilizations really revolves around weapon systems. And I'm going to read something briefly from this is Tragedy and Hope. Normally we're reading from Evolution of Civilizations, but he's got I think a more concise description here in Tragedy and Hope, because he talks about how societies go through periods of specialist weapons, and I'll just read the thing. So, on the military level, he's talking about Western civilization. In Western civilization, in the 20th century, the chief development has been a steady increase in the complexity and the cost of weapons. When weapons are cheap to get and easy to use, that almost anyone can use them after a short period of training, armies are generally made up of large masses of amateur soldiers. Such weapons we call amateur weapons, and such armies we might call mass armies of citizen soldiers. The age of Pericles in classical Greece and in the 19th century in Western civilization were periods of amateur weapons and citizen soldiers. But by the 19th century, lost my spot. But the 19th century was preceded, as was the age of Pericles, by a period in which weapons were expensive and required long training to use. Such weapons we call specialist weapons. Periods of specialist weapons are generally periods of small armies of professional soldiers, usually mercenaries. Now here's the kind of the key kicker that like you would never ever learn in public school. In a period of specialist weapons, the minority have such weapons. In a period of specialist weapons, the minority who have such weapons can usually force the majority who lack them to obey. Thus, a period of specialist weapons tends to give rise to a period of minority rule and authoritarian government. But a period of amateur weapons is a period in which all men are roughly equal in military power, and a majority can compel a minority to yield, and a majority rule or even democratic government tends to arise. There you have it right there, Nima. do you need more proof that the Second Amendment is important?
Right. I was just going to say, so wouldn't it be nice if we had it in our Constitution that, oh, wait, we do have that. But yeah, the people who oppose the Second Amendment are tyrants and authoritarians or deluded by the propaganda of tyrants and authoritarians.
Well, and let's talk a little bit about the propaganda of the in quotes anti-Second Amendment people, because it actually brings us to a very important point, which is what we're going to get into this video that we're going to react to, is that what's your AR-15 going to do against a nuclear weapon? You can't fight the government. They've got tanks and bombers and right. So basically saying that the weapons that you have access to would be obsolete in fighting the government, so you can't actually fight the government anyway, so what do you need the weapons for? Right? Now, that is actually, I mean, first off, like you just said, if you're trying to take away somebody's weapons, you're authoritarian, right? There's just literally no other room for anything else. But as we're going to see here with Zeihan, and this is what Quigley kind of mentions before he dies, basically, that he's seeing in the offing, is that when he talks about this period of specialist weapons and amateur weapons, most history is in the category of amateur weapons. I mean, he says right here it's pretty rare. The 19th century in Western civilization and the age of Pericles in ancient Greece are like two exceptions to the specialist weapon timing. But in modern day, we're seeing like this third option that's neither amateur weapon or specialist weapon, because I mean the nuclear bombs kind of have to take off the table for this conversation, because with mutual assured destruction, they're kind of the weapon of last resort. So I mean, even now we're seeing in Russia invading Ukraine, nobody's throwing nuclear weapons at each other. Hopefully they continue not to. It's still in quotes, conventional warfare.
I mean, even if it's
what's that?
Even if mutually assured destruction is a thing, even if that wasn't the case, nukes still don't have, like, did nukes help the U.S. conquer Iraq or Afghanistan?
Exactly.
Like they could have nuked them, and those countries would have had no opportunity to fight back, but they didn't because they would not solve the problem of a whole dispersed group of people who are not friendly to your rule still being around. I mean, you can't kill off everyone, right? That can't be the goal, anyways, because that's your tax base, that's your
Kill off
capital
everyone, destroy
resources,
everything, poison it for a century. Yeah.
right? So yeah, I think nukes are really kind of pointless, and even if you did use them, they wouldn't help you win the war. At the end of the day, I mean, World War II, I guess Japan was already so so much weakened from the blockades and all the other warfare methods. The nukes were just kind of like
The final
uh,
kicker.
the final kicker.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So taking nukes off the table, in terms of the specialized weapons we have now, I mean, they're so advanced, specialized doesn't even really describe them accurately. Like Tomahawk missiles and aircraft carriers and, hypersonic jets and nuclear submarine. I mean, these aren't just specialist weapons. I don't think he gives it a term in here, but these are just like hyper technological weapons. Now, obviously, your AR-15. Nemo's sharing
For
the
later,
screen.
it's for,
Oh, for later. Okay, okay. Uh, obviously, your AR-15 doesn't beat Black Hawk helicopter. It doesn't beat nuclear submarine. It doesn't beat aircraft carrier, right?
but a
But what
surface to
we've
air missile does.
it does. But can you and I afford? Well, we're getting there, right? How what we've seen in the last few wars. And Afghanistan, I mean, is kind of the quintessential example of this because Afghanistan seems to just prove this point over and over and over again. It's proved it to the only two superpowers that have ever existed on the face of the planet, both to the USSR and to the United States, which is you have these superpowers that can come in with absolutely overwhelming force. They have all the technology on their side. However, the $20 million Black Hawk helicopter can get taken down by one $5,000 rocket. And even if you have this absolutely incredibly potent, sophisticated military technology, it can become so economically expensive to utilize it. And if you have these smaller weapon systems that, I mean, I'm not saying like, hey, a $5,000 rocket is what every amateur soldier can get their hand on, but it's not a $20 million tank or whatever, right? If these smaller weapons can blow up the really super expensive destructive weapons, then the guerrilla group can cause massive, massive economic damage to the superpower. And at some point, the superpower taps out. And that's exactly what we saw both times in Afghanistan with the USSR and the United States. So I want to pull up this Zeihan video, this Peter Zeihan video, because what he talks about, because he's given an update to the Ukraine war, the Ukrainian technology that seems to be getting developed and tested out right now against the Russians, assuming that what he says is true, and even if it's not true, I'm still going to analyze his points because it's still valid, is that we may be entering a different phase of warfare where the superpowers aren't so super anymore because of the decentralized nature of this. We need to create a vocabulary for it. We got the let's call it the guerrilla weaponry, which is the in quotes $5,000 rocket, right? The guerrilla weaponry versus the superpower weaponry, which is the
Well, the word was
helicopters and aircraft
amateur.
carriers and nuclear submarines and stuff. What's that?
I mean, the word that you used earlier was amateur weaponry, right?
Yeah, amateur weaponry specifically is. Let me read it again. When weapons are so cheap to get and easy to use that almost anyone can use them after a short period of training, armies are generally made up of large masses of amateur soldiers. I don't think I don't think we're seeing large masses of amateur soldiers. I think we're seeing coordinated small groups of guerrilla units.
Okay. Yeah.
So let me pop up this Zeihan video and maximize it accordingly. Here we go. Let's listen to Le Zeihan and him not talking about Bitcoin. That was a jab at Nima.
Today, we're going to talk about the revolution in military affairs that is now going through a second phase. So the first revolution in military affairs happened in the 1990s and 2000s, when the United States started to marry information technologies to its military. It's a combination of sensors and targeting information, whether it's on the method of delivering the ordnance or in satellite or attached to the weapon itself. So, for example, joint direct attack munitions fall into that category, as do cruise missiles like the Tomahawk. Important stuff. And it basically took whatever explosive ordnance that you had and allowed you to deliver it to a target with a very high degree of accuracy. So instead of having to carpet bomb things like we used to in Vietnam and ages before, now you just send one or two weapons out and hit the specific target that you're at. There was talk for a good long time that if you marry precision weapons with hypersonics, that all of a sudden all of the rules of warfare go away and you can just have a handful of hypersonics to defend everything. And then we discovered things like jamming and the fact that people don't have one tank, they have 100,000 people in infantry, and the math never just worked out. Hypersonics are just way too expensive. It's not that they don't have a role to play, it's just that it's not the determining role.
So first off, just to summarize what he's saying here is that the 90s we saw an evolution of weaponry that allowed us to we could stop carpet bombing things, Nima, because we can target better. Great. So that's the phase one, like he said. He's going to get into phase two here in a second.
So that was kind of phase one. We're going through phase two now, which is the democratization of the application of these technologies. And so instead of it being controlled from the White House or from a general's chair, individual soldiers are now getting command of this sort of information, can use it to make targets on an autonomous basis. And we're seeing this, of course, most aggressively in Ukraine, mostly with drones. The Ukrainians are following a four-part strategy at the moment. I'm sure this is going to evolve quite a bit. Phase one is applying these drone technologies to things like jet skis and loading them up with a couple hundred pounds of explosives and sending them out to target Russian naval vessels. That process has been so effective, as I've noted in earlier videos, that basically the western half of the Black Sea is now completely no-go for the Russian fleet.
You hear that? The Russian fleet can't enter the western half of the Black Sea because of some jet skis.
Yeah, what immediately came to mind for me was the parachute Mario Kart jihadis dropping in on Israel from Gaza.
Yeah.
You know, that's also kind of a silly little device that some superpower, ostensible superpower, was powerless against, apparently. I mean, whether they chose to or not, it's a different question.
Right, but it still elaborates the point where it's like, okay, you got the ship that's cost $1 zillion to make and 20 years to build it, and then a jet ski with 50 pounds of explosive can come boom and blow a hole in it and sink it.
I mean, it seems kind of pathetic because I would have thought that they had anti-torpedo technology, all kinds of aircraft.
I don't know if he says it in this video, but I heard him say it in another video where all the boats they're designed to shoot far away, and so when something comes and to shoot aircraft, and so when something comes in close like that, they can't aim down to shoot at it. Now, I don't know about the anti-torpedo technology because that is an interesting question, but the point still stands that they're making a jet ski an effective weapon against.
I just have to ask: have we verified this? Because Peter says a lot of stuff. I don't know. He also.
Let's just keep listening because I mean, this was actually. I remember listening to Dan Carlin on this history of World War I, and a point that he brought out during about World War I is that there was very, very little naval warfare because there had been this progression of how do we build the biggest boat with the longest range guns that could shoot 10 miles, no 12 miles, no 15 miles, no 18 miles. And all the sides had these massive, massive boats, and nobody ever used them because they were so expensive they were afraid to sink them. Because it just took one torpedo. Like, they had U-boats, right? The Germans had U-boats at that point, whatever. It just took one solid strike to sink this, budget-destroying naval vessel. And, whether or not this is confirmed, I think it still makes sense. Oh, let me see what Nima's sharing here. I think it's still a viable idea based on what we were just talking about with Afghanistan. Suspected Ukrainian explosive sea drone made from recreational watercraft parts. Exactly. It's theoretically possible that if you can get the explosive over there and you can get it over there on a jet ski, that you could take out a big vessel. And if it's true, then the entire superpower Russian Navy is being held at bay by these basically DIY explosives.
And most of their ships, especially the larger ones, simply can't shoot back because anything that's installed on the deck of the ship is designed to hit the horizon or higher, and it can't angle down to target these small boats in the water. So that's number one. Number two is actually something that's much more recent that has come up as a result of the problems with the American Congress getting conventional aid to Ukraine. The Ukrainians have had to find a way to hold the line against the Russians when they're running out of artillery shells. And so what they've started doing is mass producing these very small drones that only have a payload of about a pound, which is about the size of a small grenade. And when the Russians do their human wave tactics, you just send a swarm of them out to go after anything that moves. And it's basically dropping grenades at range into massed infantry. They've done this to the point that in the Battle of Avdiivka, which the Ukrainians technically lost, they were inflicting regularly 8 and 10 to 1 casualty ratios on the Russians, despite not having much artillery. So anti-personnel. Number 3 is mid-range infrastructure strikes. The Ukrainians developed a pair of drones called the Scythe and the Beaver. Of the two, the Beaver is far more technologically competent and has a much longer range and better avionics, whereas the Scythe is basically a garage project that's practically made out of plywood. It's a fugly little thing. Carries a decent warhead, but less range. And they've been sending these out against any pieces of infrastructure in kind of the near abroad, if you will, within a few hundred kilometers of the front line. And they've used it to target any number of things like refineries in the Russian space, but also fuel depots. And then finally, something where the Americans are getting in on the job was something called the Phoenix Ghost. Now, the Phoenix Ghost only carries a fairly small warhead, typically 5 to 15 pounds. The advantage of the Phoenix Ghost is it's modular and you can put it together on the fly, and it's light enough that one soldier can carry it. Now, originally, when the Phoenix Ghosts started coming in, they were going after armored vehicles and supply trucks. But the Ukrainians very, very quickly realized that because they were available in such small volume and because they were so accurate, because unlike a lot of drones, these have a live visual feedback to the controller, they could basically put them in a backpack, send someone hiking or driving into Russia, and 1,000 miles from the front line, take it out, put it together, and send it against an unprotected target. And most of the refinery attacks we have seen in Ukraine in recent 2 weeks maybe, are probably Ukrainian special forces operating with American-made Phoenix Ghosts deep within the Russian interior.
So you hear that?
Yeah.
That's wild. So this is exactly what I was just talking about. You got someone, theoretically, I don't know if he literally means a backpack, but if someone can carry this technology, hike through the woods, assemble it, and then, get out his, PS5 controller and fly this thing to a tender target like an oil refinery or a fuel depot or something like that, or a pipeline. This is some crazy decentralized warfare. Oh, what would you pull up here?
I have a picture of the dude you were just talking about.
Okay, there he is. you we have this crazy decentralized warfare where I mean, if we go back again to what Quigley was saying, which is okay, whether it's specialized or amateur, I think the more important point is, can the minority dominate the majority? And if we're in a situation where these small payloads can cause damage to these incredibly economically expensive technologies, ships and tanks and whatever, refineries, whatever. And it could be decentralized to the point where, and I think Peter's going to mention this in a minute, let's say you take 10,000 people and send them with backpacks into the woods, and they're all independently flying these little suckers around. That's like fighting a swarm of bees. And I could really see that if this is being worked out now, theoretically here in the Ukraine, and that this is modern technology, we've mentioned this before in terms of where we see, we usually talk about Western civilization, but I guess this applies to the whole Earth, that we're more and more moving into the world of decentralization at almost every strata of our society and our civilization. This is some serious decentralization applied to the military sector. And if this technology can proliferate to an underdog like the Ukraine, what else can it proliferate to?
Well, I mean, the Ukraine isn't an underdog. The Ukraine is NATO and the US and the CIA and the most powerful military in the world, basically shipping weapons every day, right? So I wouldn't necessarily call them underdog, but your point is valid that warfare is becoming more decentralized one way or another. And all countries will have to adapt to that. If we're done talking about military technology, there's that thing that I shared earlier. And Zeihan also mentioned at the beginning of this clip that warfare in and of itself is totally changing into a new kind of domain. It's not even really all about weaponry. It's actually much more about the ability to manipulate the access to information hubs and nodes to disseminate information to people. Uh, as much as I hate the word misinformation, obviously plays a
You
huge
got
role.
to use it. You can't battle the noble lie.
Right. Actually, I'm just going to share this thing that I shared in the beginning. Let's see, where is this? So Wikipedia about fifth generation warfare. Okay. Fifth generation warfare is, I think there's some truth to this theory. Fifth generation warfare is warfare that is conducted primarily through non kinetic military action, such as social engineering, misinformation, cyber attacks, along with emerging technologies such as AI and fully autonomous systems. Fifth generation warfare has been described by Daniel Abbott as a war of information and perception. So, to add to these different technologies that you just discussed, the jet ski drones, the modular drones that Zeihan described, a huge part of warfare today is this kind of warfare, access to information nodes to disseminate misinformation and to pursue social engineering, and the ability to conduct cyber attacks, in other words, IT know-how, uh, plays a huge role in today's warfare. Some people say we're already in World War III, right? It's just fought on a different plane, basically.